on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Last month, we had Dr. Paul Farmer on the program talking about his new book. And by the way, a week after he appeared on the program, he won a $1 million humanitarian prize. We can't promise that to all our guests. But Dr. Farmer said the person I should really talk to, because we bonded over our shared love of the concept of social medicine. He said the person you should really talk to in that area is Michelle Morse. I'm delighted to have her on the show because since I had that conversation with Dr. Farmer, Dr. Morse has received a new job. So let me give you her full bio, then we'll welcome her. Dr. Michelle Morse is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital. She's an internist. She's the co-founder of Equal Health and Social Medicine Consortium. And this year, Dr. Morse was named the first chief medical officer for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, which struck me, she will correct me if I'm wrong, but which struck me as an exciting opportunity to take the concept of social medicine and apply it in a very intense real life application. So without any further ado, Dr. Michelle Morse, welcome to the program. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Richard RJ, for having me. It's a real honor to, of course, get to join the show. And it's a real honor to follow, of course, one of my most amazing mentors, Paul Farmer. But yeah, really excited to be a part of the conversation today and talk a little bit about this new opportunity for pushing social medicine into action.
So I'm right. I think, Dr. Morse, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is in fact, and briefly just, and you can correct my definition, but social medicine has been around at least since the 1800s as a concept that, I mean, I think Dr. Rudolf Virchow saw an epidemic in Silesia and said, this epidemic is not just it is not, quote unquote, the fault of the people who receive it. There are social forces at work here. And it seems to me you're now, with your new job, in the epicenter of just such a crisis as Dr. Virchow described 200 years ago, right? Because New York City is facing the pandemic and the racialized and class-driven illnesses and morbidity and mortality that go along with that. Is that correct in your view?
Absolutely. I think that is exactly the kind of thread that we need to be lifting up, that none of this is new. I think public health has, as a field, traditionally really claimed social medicine as well, right? That the biomedical model is insufficient, that the social and structural drivers of health and well-being are the most important forces for us to be understanding and interrupting. And I think that, each pandemic that occurs, whether it's the 19th century, the 20th, or the 21st, seems to unfortunately prove that point in a dramatic and often painful and violent way. And in the 20th century, it was the AIDS pandemic, right? It was AIDS and the AIDS movement, which is, I have to say, where a lot of my political education came from as a medical student. Getting involved in the AIDS movement was just transformative for me. And so, yes, I think that thread of the history of social medicine and a social and structural analysis as a part of understanding why the patterns of disease occur the way that they do. And certainly, as you said, New York City has been an epicenter for that, for COVID, but it was also the case, again, for the AIDS movement prior to that, for tuberculosis in the 1930s, which is a big part of the reason why in addition to being chief medical officer, I'm also the deputy commissioner for the Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness. And a big part of our work in the division is place-based investments through the neighborhood action centers, which go back decades to tuberculosis in the 1930s, where folks also understood that to practice public health and social medicine, we needed to make place-based investments in the places that were suffering the most. And so I think that social medicine calls us to do that. I think that public health calls us to do that. And I think that there are also people in the field of medicine, physicians, nurses, and others who are also starting to take up this call. And that's a big part of my charge in these new positions, is to really make that connection between health systems and public health, and get the health systems and the medical teams on board with the mission of public health.
I feel, Dr. Morse, that you have the opportunity in New York City of modeling something that the rest of the country can follow. And I was thinking, as you were speaking about the history of epidemics and plagues in this country, the AIDS epidemic is a perfect example to me of one of the missing pieces, and maybe in post-war World War II public health, I'm not sure, but the sense of the social factor to me started to become diminished. There became more of a focus on individual behaviors, reducing fat reduction or whatever, exercise, all of which, have a role, but at the expense of these social factors, so that a stigma came with it, right? I mean, a kind of AIDS epidemic is a perfect example. Well, they shouldn't have, they shouldn't have been gay, or they shouldn't have been promiscuous or whatever, sort of blaming the patient, the victim. My memory, obviously I wasn't around for the tuberculosis epidemic of the 1930s, but my memory of studying that was that it was associated with immigrants and the other with a capital O. Now we have the racialized and class impact of COVID-19. Sometimes I think for the people who don't want to do enough about COVID-19, they see that as a feature and not a bug. So, which is, a harsh way to put it, but it just strikes me, at least subconsciously, that way. So I'm just wondering, for example, as you and your team address the ongoing, hopefully receding pandemic we're in now, so the other health issues of the city, how you see you're reaching out to other health systems, to providers, practitioners in various fields, how you see that, if you see that as a part of your challenge to overcome that, if you get what I'm talking about, that individualistic sense of stigma versus that collective sense of greater forces involved that we need to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a profound challenge. And I think that you're totally right that the trends over the past several decades, particularly with neoliberalism and some of the economic models, of course, that racial capitalism, these are all, I think, economic models that also facilitate that individualistic focus in a way that is very challenging to upend. And at the same time, as I see that as one of our greatest challenges, I also have tremendous hope because of the work that, organizers, the Black Lives Matter movement, which built, of course, on Standing Rock and Occupy and other movements. I mean, social movements are what allows us to build critical consciousness at scale. And so much of the work that organizers are doing, I think, has created a window, even in more conservative disciplines like medicine, for a new kind of conversation, a new kind of questioning, a new kind of critical analysis, and an interest in political education that I'll just say, in my short life, I haven't seen this level of interest in asking those critical questions and questioning everything like I'm seeing right now. So I think that though that is one of our greatest challenges, getting folks within the disciplines that are health related to shift from that individualistic model, particularly when it's so easy for us to say, well, you're non-compliant with your medication, so this is not my problem, right? Again, to your point about kind of individualistic patient blaming types of behavior, to shift into a much more structural and social analysis, like this is the time when we can do that and at scale. And I think that part of what I really appreciate about the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene is that There is already this focus on parallel pandemics. That is a part of kind of the mission and vision of the current commissioner, Dr. Chakshi. And I would say, in addition to that, that builds on a long tradition in this public health department in trying to push upstream, and former commissioners did the same. So I do think that we have a unique opportunity, to your point, to keep building on that, to recognize, yes, we have COVID, and yes, we have massive pandemic level social inequity, not just in New York City, but across the world. And a big part of the reason why I was also interested in joining this team is because New York City is one of the most global cities in the world. And having been in the global health space for the past 15 years, I really see this as an opportunity for me to, again, bring that kind of global solidarity lens to the work that is happening here in New York City. And that is already something that I think folks have been doing and making connections around.
And again, we're talking with Dr. Michelle Morse, who is the new medical director, chief medical officer for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And Dr. Morse, this is among some people perhaps slightly sensitive topic, but it seems to me that even some of the more, you mentioned neoliberalism, that even some of the more well-intentioned responses to the data we've seen about the racial disproportionality of COVID-19 has led people down what might be a bit of the wrong path, which is and again, I'm getting into, I know, sensitive areas for some people. They want to kind of leave the economic dimensions of structural racism out of it, and basically just express it in some other way. The danger there, it seems to me, is that can play into a very long history of exoticizing Black bodies, and assuming if there's no social or economic factor causing this disproportionate racial impact, then in fact, even if you think you're liberal, you're saying, you're assuming a difference in physicality. But the alternative, it seems to me, and I'd love your thoughts on this, the only alternative is to say, okay, well, what are the channels by which this racism is actually causing, whether it's difference in COVID deaths, whether it's the 7 to 10 times as many childhood deaths from asthma we see in Black children, whichever the factor is you want to see, it seems to me it's got to take us to areas that maybe some folks who consider themselves progressive might not want to talk about. Economic disparities in access to healthcare, environmental differences. And I'm sorry, I'm preaching a little bit, and I don't mean to, but because I really want to phrase it as a question. If you agree with that analysis, do you have thoughts about responding to it? And if you don't, let me know where you think I'm wrong. Yeah, no, I'm very aligned with that. I think that that's true. I think that I am also thankful for the intellectual leaders who have kind of come before me and us, who've laid the groundwork for us to take that analysis and do something really powerful with it and ask better questions. So I'm so thankful that we already have some of the language, the theory, racial capitalism, again, being one of the central ones, and certainly critical race theory also being central to this. And I hope that our work in the New York City Health Department continues to build on those traditions and that analysis, and couldn't agree more. I think that we have to be direct about talking about the class analysis here, and how it intersects with structural racism. Absolutely. I think we probably have lost the thinking on this, but if you remember the very early days of COVID, particularly when it was more, the pandemic was more focused in China, social and economic research came out showing that the rates of COVID, even in neighborhoods in China, the rates were 3 to 4 times higher for the socioeconomically deprived neighborhoods in China. So there's also, there's been social inequity, economic inequity, et cetera, throughout this pandemic. And I think it's easy to lose the thread, let's just say that. But I do think that, to your point, I think it's incredibly important that we continue to lift that part of the analysis up, right? And keep talking about the fact that poverty is not something that just happens. Poverty is something that's created by policies. It's created by culture, actually. It's created by white supremacy. It is
it is a social condition in and of itself that is completely fixable, remediable. We can eliminate it. We can completely change it. And yet we don't talk enough about that aspect of social and structural change. I'm excited again to be able to bring that in. And I think that you're right. It's very easy to look at the racial inequities in COVID or in anything and say, man, there's just something biologically or genetically wrong with people of color or with Black people. Black people get called out often in this way. It's easy to make that mistake. I've seen, members of Congress make that mistake, right? I mean, I'm not going to name names, but, when the racial inequities were really being made visible early in the pandemic here in the US in the spring of last year, I heard members of Congress saying that there's just some kind of a biological and genetic component to this. And that's wrong. I think W.E.B. Du Bois would be appalled, right? I mean, central to his work at the turn of the last century was proving this is not social inequity and racial inequities in outcomes, in health outcomes, and in well-being is socially driven, not biologically driven. And I think he would be so depressed that we're still having that conversation 100 years later, after the completion of the Human Genome Project that showed that there is really no biological meaning to race. And people confuse race and ancestry all the time. I'm not talking about ancestry, I'm talking about race. And so I do think it's very easy to uphold those kind of white supremacist assumptions about biological differences in between races. And it's easy to see how those play out in medicine all the time as well, whether you're looking at correction of kidney function for Black race, or you're looking at correction of lung function for Black race, which are clinical practices that we still do to this day in 2021 and have their roots in eugenics and racist medicine from 150, 200 years ago. So I do think that people make that mistake all the time. And it's a convenient mistake, to your point about individualistic instead of social structural, because then it's well, we just can't fix that, right? I can't fix your DNA or your biological inferiority. And so it also is paralyzing, right? And pours cold water on any movement for social and structural change. So yes, it's deep, it's profound, and yet we have to continually struggle and chip away at that ideology and call it out anytime we see it, because it's so damaging. It upholds white supremacy, and it keeps us from pushing for the social and structural change that we know is necessary to achieve any kind of level of global health equity.
And it leads us to borrow a phrase from the mid-20th century, it leads us to the soft bigotry of low expectations, in this case in health, that somehow, you guys are just, a liberal could say, you guys are just different and wish we could do more, but at least for keeping our money, and you guys are, So, Dr. Michelle Morse, I know you're limited in time. There are a million more things I would love to talk to you about. I feel like we just got halfway there. Someday, I hope we get to talk about the mental hygiene part of this too, and the interplay of those. But I thank you very much on behalf of myself and my audience. Again, Dr. Michelle Morse is the new Chief Medical Officer for New York City's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I'm excited that you're there, and I hope we'll get a chance to speak again and get an update on how it's going. So thank you for coming. Thank you so much for having me. Very much appreciated, and look forward to the next conversation. As do we. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. This is The Zero Hour.